All right, thanks again to our panelists. I'd like to invite Troy Eid to the stage. He's going to give a presentation about ethics. Mr. Eid co-chairs the American Indian Law Practice Group and represents companies in criminal and civil investigations and enforcement actions.
You're good.
Oh,
You're good.
Okay.
I'll take it.
All right.
Hi, everybody. I'm Troy Eid, and I'm here as a guest of Senator Ellis, and I'm honored to see Affy. We served together on the Indian Law and Order Commission. She looks the same. I have aged considerably. I used to have hair. She still has beautiful hair. I'm honored to be here. I'll need a clicker. Can I have a clicker? That's. Oh, and do I point it at you? Is that rude? All right. So I'm going to do tribal ethics, energy development, and I'm going to do it in 30 minutes, actually 29 minutes. So bear with me. The non-lawyers in the room will have to understand that I'm only going to show one ethics rule. So please don't run out. I promise I won't be a lawyer dancing on the head of a pin. I am the president emeritus of the Navajo Nation Bar Association. I'm glad to be here in that capacity. So I'm going to talk a bit about Navajo. I'm going to fill in what happened before the 2013 Energy Plan in a few minutes to give you a sense. But I want you to know, if you remember nothing else about this presentation, that the fundamental ethics requirements when you work in Indian country or when you visit Indian country is to understand what competence means. We have a duty under the model rules, and I would suggest respectfully it applies to anyone in business, anyone in government, that you act not just, if you happen to be a lawyer, as a consultant, as an engineer, whatever you are, whatever you purport to be, at least we have a codified duty as lawyers under the rules of professional responsibility, not just to be hired guns, but to actually, quote, be public citizens having special responsibility for the quality of justice. Now, if you want a great public citizen, there are lots in this room. Senator Ellis is one. Lisa Yellow Eagle from Southern Utah is another. There are a lot of great ones who are here. And I just say that much of the time that I spend, I'm a lawyer, I practice in Denver, privileged to represent Southern Ute and Ute Mountain Ute in the lawsuit against the governor of Colorado for infringing on our right to engage in sports betting. I want to thank your governor. I want to say that every state is different. We're not in the best time right now, given the situation we have in Colorado, but it could be worse. I've been mediating, just to give you an example of how every place is different and being competent is different everywhere you are when you're approaching Indian country. You got to try to be open. You have to ask questions and try not to talk too much. I was appointed last March by the Seneca Indian Nation in New York, by the governor of New York, by the Attorney General of New York, and by something called the New York State Thruway Authority, which runs all the toll roads in New York, to try to settle a case that's been in litigation in the federal court since 1994, continuously. And in a nutshell, it involves a right-of-way. Anybody been to Buffalo, New York? It's better when it's not the winter, but it's a beautiful place. But when you come out of Buffalo on I-90, you're heading toward west on Lake Erie, you cross part of the Seneca Indian Nation's reservation. Well, in 1954, right-of-way was built there for I-90. It's been a toll road since 1954. It was the first leg of Eisenhower's interstate highway system. And did you know, according to the federal courts, that there was never a valid easement for that right-of-way crossing tribal land? And did you know, as a wrinkle, I did not. I was appointed and did not know this. And it's embarrassing. You think you're some great legal hotshot, but I didn't know. Did you know that the treaty the Seneca Indian Nation has with the state of New York was done during the Articles of Confederation and not under the Constitution, not when George Washington was president or later? And did you know they own their land in something called restricted fee status, which is unique and has a body of statutes now, federal statutes that are unique only to the Seneca Indian Reservation, which say that they own the land. They can do whatever they want with the land, so long as they don't sell it. And if they sell it, they have to go to Congress. But otherwise, it's private property in effect. Of course, it's tribal property. but there's no easement there. So back and forth, states saying sovereign immunity, you can't go to federal court and try to have an easement. You can't get damages. Tribe going back and forth for decades and decades. So finally, litigation got to the point where the tribe came up with a theory and said, well, we're not going to fight about past damages, which have been publicly estimated just in tolls at about $3 billion in present value of money for tolls that have been collected since 1954 on I-90. And imagine the tolls, because they're different for commercial vehicles. Think of all the trucks. If you've been on that road, you've been on the road. But prospectively, it's possible to sue. You can sue the governor. You can sue tribe. You can sue the governor. You can sue the Thruway Authority. You can actually now prospectively say, you got to get an easement. And by the way, it's completely up to the Seneca Indian Nation what that easement entails. And by the way, the compensation is up to bargain for arm's length negotiation. So that's where we are. And at that point, the case came back from the U.S. Court of Appeals. It went back to the Western District of New York. And I got a call from lawyers from both sides saying, we wanted to get a local mediator, but we need somebody who's done a lot of mediation between states and tribes. We'd like somebody who knows about transportation, and we like somebody who can try to help the parties settle this case. So here I am getting ready. I'm flying up to Buffalo. Thank God I was delayed in O'Hare, but I still made my flight, connecting flight. And then I figured out, like literally at 2 a.m, that I was not dealing with Indian trust land as I understood it. I actually had a whole body of law I didn't know anything about. And I had to show up there in the morning at 8:30 and start working to try to help these folks. I mean, it was sheer incompetence. And so I just want to say, I got into the room, and by that time, you're meeting privately with each party. You're trying to figure out, can you get them in the same room? Mediator's not a lawyer, right? They can be a lawyer. They don't have to be, but you should know something about the law and the policy and so on. So I'm trying to learn as much as I can from each side. And without getting into, any other details that are sensitive, I did have one conversation I'm permitted to tell you about, which is I was thinking, well, this is going to have to be a political solution of some sort. Meaning that in addition to whatever happens in the court, because the litigation is still going on, they're going to have to find some way to get along in the future. And I wondered to myself, what kind of political leverage does the Seneca Indian Nation have in the state of New York? So I thought about, where I'm from, Colorado, or, the tribes that Appy and I traveled, for 4 years around Indian country just for the Indian Law and Order Commission for President Obama. Thought about all these places I've been, or the tribes I represent, like Oglala Sioux Tribe. And I thought about, what am I going to do to understand the leverage? So I started asking questions of the tribal council members who were all gathered. I said, well, how much do you give money to candidates? Do you have Seneca Nation members serving in state government? I had a whole list of things I thought about. I thought I was being really clever. Finally, Mo John, who's in his 90s, had his Vietnam veterans cap on. He just looked at me and he kind of shook his head. And he had this incredulous look. He said, Mr. Colorado, you must understand, Mr. Colorado, we don't vote in state elections. We don't vote in local elections. And with all due respect, how dare you suggest that we vote in local elections? I said, well, what do you mean, sir? I mean, I was stunned. He said, my grandmother wrote a letter to President Coolidge in 1924, rejecting her U.S. citizenship under the Indian Citizenship Act because we didn't consent to the United States. It wasn't even the government that our treaty was with in 1794. Why would we ever vote in a state and local election? And at that point, the tribal council members said, of course we don't participate in state politics. The government of the United States is illegitimate. So I've got a U.S. military veteran, he's got a cap on, combat veteran, other veterans in the room, fought for the United States. But what are the first lessons? Again, competence, not making assumptions. I tell you, every day I do this job, every place I go, from Alaska to Florida, every day is a learning experience. In the competence quest for a non-Indian, my dad came from Egypt with $100 in 1956. He's passed on, My mom's, son's in Norway from northern Wisconsin. We still have her. I'm not native. Everything is new, no matter how much I think I know and travel and try to work in Indian country. So that's what this presentation is about. And that's why I have to try to do my best to keep it short. You got to be competent. You have to understand each tribe's different. They have the right to make their own laws and be ruled by them. And so you never depart from the basic principles. Tribes are sovereigns. They predate the Constitution. They have powers that are inherent. Congress, the Supreme Court has said, can interfere with that, can terminate tribes recognition, can modify, can say we recognize this tribe like Klamath, and then they, by treaty, and then 1961, John F. Kennedy can get rid of the recognition, and then 1986, Ronald Reagan can restore it. All this stuff happens under this so-called plenary power doctrine, right, that the Supreme Court concocted out of the Indian Commerce Clause of the Constitution in 1903, and a little bit before that in the Kagama case. But the typical background premise is Congress has got a lot of power, but states don't, unless Congress says that they do have power. Those are the basic principles to think as especially non-Indian about what is the competency, where do I start to spot issues, understanding the homeland. And all these slides are in your packet, and I'm glad to talk to anybody afterwards because we don't have a whole lot of time to go through a lot of these slides. But I want you to always think about the Constitution. Think about what it says about Indians and tribes. Those are the legal terms, the terms that are used. And I am the supposed chair of the Indian Law Department at the University of Denver College of Law as an adjunct because it's just me, but I teach the Native Nations and federal law curriculum in the program there. And we have to drill on these things because people read the Constitution occasionally. Maybe they never read it, really. I don't know if you had it in your high school. I didn't, in terms of what it says about tribes and about Indians. And it's important to understand that we fought a civil war. Blacks, enslaved people, were counted as three-fifths person for purposes of House appropriation, apportionment rather, for how many members serve from each state in the U.S. House of Representatives. That's in Article 1, Section 2. But after the war, still the rule was, it is in the Constitution, excluding Indians not taxed. It was not until 1924, through this law I just talked about, the Indian Citizenship Act, that we finally had this concept that, oh, Indians are part of this government in terms of how representation is apportioned, but they didn't consent to it, and they got their rights by statute, not by the Constitution. Critically important. No other group of American citizens got their rights by statute. We have also this Commerce Clause I talked about. You can tell me where plenary power is. I'm a textualist. I may be like Neil Gorsuch. I may be a hypertextualist, but I don't see plenary power in the Indian Commerce Clause. It just says that Congress regulates commerce with the tribes, all right? But that's how the courts have interpreted it now for well over 100 years. And then we've got the treaty power in the executive branch of government. President makes treaties. Didn't say tribes. The practice was tribes were separate nations, the original understanding of the Constitution. 1871, Congress said, we don't believe that anymore, and we haven't had a treaty since. But tribes still have their treaties, and they still matter because they're still the law of the land. All right, so they're polities, what political scientists call polities, tribes are. There's a trust responsibility that was talked about. Why is there a trust responsibility? I've trained more than 150 police officers just in Colorado on cross-deputation agreements. And I always like to ask them about, well, do we still have a responsibility to tribes? Is there anything called the trust duty? And is it over? When does it end? And the question comes as a new one for most people. They don't understand why we even have this duty. The duty is because tribes were coerced into giving up land. And the idea the courts came up with to deal with that in the early 19th century was, if you're forced to give up land, the consolation is the federal government will protect you, will look out for you. It's kind of like Italy and Vatican City, right? Somebody invades The Vatican, the Italians are supposed to protect, right? The Italian government's supposed to protect. Maybe the Vatican police will do a better job. I don't know. But that's the concept. Or France and Monaco. That was literally, they talk about this in the Federalist Papers, and it's talked about in the early Marshall Trilogy cases. Talk about this analogy. If you give up land, the so-called weaker is protected by the stronger, meaning political, in effect, military power. That's the concept, and that's why it's a permanent duty. It doesn't end. We don't wake up one day, and this is why this discussion over the 45Q tax credit and pore space, which I thought was a great discussion with respect to carbon sequestration and storage, it's really relevant. The BIA says, oh, we don't want to deal with that. Well, it's important they deal with it, because this is not, as soon as the government stops dealing with these things, is it going to come back? And yet it's a permanent responsibility. It wasn't supposed to be temporary, and it was never intended to be temporary. So from that comes this obligation to consult on a government-to-government basis. That's why it's there. That's where it comes from legally. Tribes are governments, and the federal government, when it does things that affect tribes, it's supposed to meaningfully consult with tribes. That comes and flows from the trust responsibility. So the trust responsibility is not protected legally when you think about it, right? Consultation also is eroded and undermined. And so that's where the obligation comes from. Picture I took when the Ruby Pipeline was being built, now owned by Tallgrass, formerly by El Paso, delivering natural gas from Wyoming, primarily, to the West Coast. When it was under construction, like a lot of pipelines we could talk about, didn't cross any tribal lands. But you need federal permits. You needed a permit for an interstate pipeline from the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to be able to build a pipeline. You need other permits, water crossings from the Army Corps of Engineers. When you need those kinds of federal permissions, guess what? You have an instant duty that the federal government must consult with all the tribes that are affected, that have cultural, spiritual ties to that land, to that place. In that case, that project was 86 tribes. This happens all the time. Why does that matter? And how does it inform competence? Judge Skavdal here, fine judge in the District of Wyoming, 2015, he enjoined the BLM fracking rules, hydraulic fracturing rules. Why did he do that? Well, in part, the Southern Ute Indian tribe and other tribes sued to say BLM has these new regulations on fracking. They apply to BLM lands and to tribal lands. They didn't consult meaningfully with us. We went to a meeting, the rules were written, and the BLM told us we were going to like them. And the tribe sued and said, that's not meaningful consultation. And guess what? Judge Skavdal in the District of Wyoming, Obama appointee, as it turns out, Judge Skavdal said, we're going to block these rules from being implemented in the entire United States because, in part, there was no meaningful tribal consultation. And there was a lot of litigation after that, but those rules never took effect. And that the rules collapsed as a result of tribes that said, hey, some of us actually engage in fracking. We kind of like to have this discussion. And even if we don't engage in fracking, we want to be consulted. The federal government has that obligation. It's a federal rule. It concerns federal matters triggering tribal consultation. This is a critical concept. And I'll tell you that I practice in a firm with a group of colleagues. We probably are hired once every 2 or 3 weeks by some entity. It may be on the tribal side, it may be on the utility side, transmission company. Someone, somewhere, some lawyer didn't understand that tribes can sue if the federal government doesn't consult meaningfully with them. Tribes can intervene in litigation. They don't have to be in the spot. They could have been forcibly removed to another part of the country. They still have legal rights. That flows from the trust doctrine, which in turn recognizes government-to-government consultation. Competence. And so a rule applies to the whole nation. Why did the Dakota, how many remember the Dakota Access Pipeline controversy of 2016, right? So this pipeline is currently delivering crude oil from the Bakken down into the Permian, where it goes eventually into the network to be refined and so on. This project required tribal consultation. There was a nationwide permit, a linear permit called 12. There was also a water crossing in the Missouri River. The pipeline was directionally drilled 105 feet below Lake Oahe, which is the third largest reservoir in the United States by water volume. And two tribes, didn't cross tribal land, but two tribes, Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, both said no meaningful consultation was held with us. Well, they litigated. They went to court. They've never won one motion that I know of any consequence since 2016. However, by intervening, those of you in the energy industry who are not from tribal energy industries, be mindful. The project was more than $1 billion over budget because of the intervention of those two tribes. The delays that it caused, according to court documents, public court documents that we reviewed, more than $1 billion of additional costs just because the tribes intervened in that litigation. They didn't even have to win the motions, let alone the case. And guess what? That is still being litigated, as many of you know. The judge has said the tribal consultation was not meaningful. And you, district court judge, you need to figure out what to do. At one point, the district court judge who's in Washington, D.C., Judge Boasberg, tried to shut off the pipeline. The DC Circuit Court of Appeals said, no, you can't shut off the flow of oil, but you got to figure something else out. So they're actually litigating that right now. You may have forgotten, easy to forget, that this litigation is still going on. Remember that the next time your land department shows up and says, we've got this great idea for a pipeline and it doesn't cross any tribal lands, it's going to be smooth sailing, okay? Because this is the world that we live in. And for tribal leaders, remember, I know you know, but remember your consultation rights. They're only as strong as you make them. Otherwise, they're like winter's water rights. Unless you're adjudicated, they're paper rights. They're theoretical rights. You have to make them real as you do. As you do. All right. We can't have a discussion on ethics in tribes and energy development without talking about William Faulkner. What? William Faulkner? Who likes William Faulkner? Anybody? All right. So Oprah Winfrey said he was the greatest living author, but he wasn't living, and it was kind of an embarrassing interview, but he did pass on a while ago, and I never met him, but I am kind of an elder, but not that old. So Faulkner's often quoted for this, and it actually is true. He wrote that the past isn't dead, it's not even past. Although Requiem for a Nun is kind of it's kind of a tough read, but anyway, I would just say, this is the last point I'm going to talk about because I'm still within my time. I got 5 minutes. It's good. See, I'm making up time. So I'm going to talk about navigation real quick because I spend a lot of my time working down there. You are looking at the commissioner of the Shiprock Bar District right now. I'm very proud to have been elected. I think I got 7 votes. I'm pretty excited. So, but we have actually a bar of about 700 members that I was privileged to lead for the 4 years during COVID. The tragic 4 years where we actually lost to COVID, just of our bar members. We had 18 die of COVID just during COVID. People have no idea the hardship that happened in Indian country during COVID. And it wasn't one thing, it was dirty water, which kills more people at Navajo than anything else is dirty water. The fact that people don't have clean water, and the fact that people haul water in way too many cases and the containers are dirty. The fact that people are crammed into inadequate housing. Where I work up at Oglala, you know, the estimate now by the tribal council is we have 27 people living in every housing unit, 27. And I will just tell you, I'm the expert witness for the tribe in Oglala Sioux Tribe versus United States for inadequate law enforcement funding. You know, that's not adequate housing. You know, people are crammed into these units. There's so many reasons why people suffered in Indian country during COVID. A lack of preparation. How could the great Navajo Nation, served by the Indian Health Service, have, when COVID broke out in March of 2020, they had 3 ventilators for the entire reservation. They had 3 that were functioning, 3. So it's important to understand what we're dealing with when it comes to energy development. I run a lot of ultra marathons. This was on a 50-mile race. My wife was crewing me, which means that she was wondering what the hell I was doing running through this. But it's a land of tremendous beauty and tremendous changing all the time and yet never changing. And I know many of you have been there. When you're in the Grand Canyon National Park, that's the Tanner Trail hiking down to the river. Everything kind of lit up to the right is Navajo Nation. Visitors, 4 million people go to the south rim of the Grand Canyon every year. There's now, you can let me know, I was at the Grand Canyon 2 weeks ago. There's not one sign that I saw that says, that's Navajo over there you're looking at. You're not looking at the national park. There's not one sign acknowledging Navajo. They finally renamed Indian Gardens like 4 years ago to Havasupai Gardens. I mean, they have some work to do. Navajo Mountain, the most remote area of the reservation. If you fly from Denver, and I'm sorry, on behalf of Colorado, I apologize for DIA. I know it's just the worst airport ever right now. Not my fault, but I suffer with you. If you fly to Phoenix or Las Vegas, you see it out the window. You can tell it's the only mountain for like 100 miles in any direction. It's where a lot of Navajo people were able to hide out when they were being hunted down, and they were able to prosper and help the people when they came back from the long walk. So the last panel and James did a tremendous job talking about this. Four Corners Power Plant is one of them. Did you know that because of subsidies by the federal government and direct ownership, in some cases, including Navajo Generating Station, we had the largest concentration of coal-fired power plants in the entire United States was around the Navajo Nation. NGS, of course, has been blown up in 2019, demolished. They're cleaning that site up. You've still got San Juan, which has been closed, and then you've got Four Corners, which is operating and was talked about with respect to NTEC. The coal development is going to be my last point here, because I want to make the point about the past not being even past. What am I talking about? When I started practicing law at Navajo in 2005, the general fund budget was 85% funded by coal at Navajo. Right now, it's about 50% funded. But coal is still a very big deal there. And I'm not here to trash coal, by the way. I have no political view in this presentation about coal. I'm just explaining the United States government and what happens when you go down and you start to talk about, hey, I've got this great renewable energy project. You don't need to use coal anymore. Everything's going to be great. It's going to work out fine. And that may well be the case. Your project may be the best project ever. They may love it down there. But you need to understand, who was here before? Who said the same thing about coal? Someone did at some point. Someone did. And might have said you'll have great electricity, but we still have, almost 25% of our population at Navajo still doesn't have electricity. But we sure had the coal-fired power plants. So just public matters, not picking on Peabody coal per se, but I'm just saying it is a matter of public record that through the year 1983, from the late 60s, for the coal-fired power plants, Navajo Mine was owned differently, but for 3 of the other coal-fired power plants, including one at Laughlin, Nevada, that's also closed, that they received $141 million from coal sales. The nation got only $2.7 million in royalties. And then when it was audited in '84, guess what? It turned out that the BIA, who had hired the lawyer for the tribe, for the Navajo Nation, and also for Hopi on Black Mesa, that the royalty rate was 2%. It was 10 times below the average, 10 times below. That's just a historical fact. And then what happened? Many of you know, some of you lived through it. Peabody went with the Secretary of the Interior, and they worked out a deal to keep the rate artificially low. The BIA's economist said it should be at least 20% royalty rate, but it was agreed behind closed doors, Navajo Nation not knowing about it for years, not learning about it, that the rate would be 12.5% for the next 20 years. And then in '87, that's what happened. It was approved. The nation found out about it, sued for back royalties. This triggered the predecessor to what you heard about, the 2013 energy report. The predecessor was the 1992 report, which said, we can't be relying on others. We have to build our own energy industry, which eventually led to the detailed plan that was James discussed so well. The nation went to the US Supreme Court twice. They said, we have no trust responsibility to pay you damages. There's no statute that says we do. So they didn't get any money for that. That was just lost, and it's never been recovered. So all the water that was used, the coal extracted, it was what it was. There was no compensation for the deliberate connivance to keep the royalty rates below what was the proper rate according to the Interior Department's own economist. However, there were leases. The leases were below market too. The leases for the areas where the mines were, where the power plants were, included the Peabody-owned Kayenta mine. There were 2 mines on Black Mesa being the other one. And I just put this up to illustrate. Again, I'm not picking on Peabody. I'm just telling you, you need to be competent. What happened in Navajo before you decided to go there and say, I got this cool wind project. You're going to love it. Trust me. The station's annual lease payments for a Navajo generating station, which I mentioned was blown up in 2019, were around $600,000 a year before. They were way below market value. And as soon as the term ran out, finally, the nation had its own lawyers. They could negotiate at arm's length. There were no backroom deals. Interior didn't hide the ball. They jumped from $600,000 a year to $43 million per year. You know, what does that say? And then what it says is that the nation went to court and said, hey, by the way, federal government, you just agreed to a new lease. And they found a way and they got a settlement for the back lease payments. They sought 900 million, they got 554 million, the nation did, to try to true that up a bit. So some relief on the leases, nothing at all on the royalties. So with that in mind, I would just say, since I think we're about out of time, thank you. Please contact me. The slides are toward the back. They're in the presentation. My contact information is there if I can help you with anything. Just remember that we're not in this alone, not here to criticize, but the first thing about ethics is to be competent. When you go out there, you know, make sure you know who owns the land. Don't be like me, think you understand it and don't. Make sure you looked at the laws because tribes get to make those. That's their rights. Make sure you, when you don't know something, don't sell, stop selling, maybe listen. And just understand a lot of people came before you. Some of them are great, wonderful people, and some of them weren't. Thank you. And I don't know if we have time for maybe just one question, otherwise I'll exit, which is fine. Thank you.